It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. I stumbled on this article this week. Not this week, it was like last week. And it's called, rightly titled, The Bizarre Story Behind the FBI's Fake Documentary About the Bundy Family. And I'm reading this article. Excellent work. It's on the Intercept, intercept.com. Check this out. And I'm reading this thing, this fascinating story about how the FBI goes undercover and they're saying they're going to do a documentary. And they're filming all the characters around that Bundy standoff and the Hammond Ranch, the Oregon standoff. Who's the author? Trevor Aaronson, a friend of the show. He's been on before. We had him on for a good 2 hours a while back. He's the author of the book, The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. So go back in the archives and check out our first interview with Trevor Aaronson. And also, too, you know what? I'm gonna do a playlist on YouTube, too, at Bundy Ranch, all the shows we've done about Bundy Ranch. But today we have Trevor Aaronson. Trevor, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thank you so much. I forgot to mention, too, he's got a website, TrevorAaronson.com. Okay, brother. Like we were just saying off the air, I love this article, man. It's what a story, you know?
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Great stuff, man. Great work, too. But before we get started, tell us about yourself. Who's Trevor Aaronson?
Sure. So I'm a journalist. I for the last, I guess going on 7-8 years now, I've focused on the intersection of national security and civil liberties, and my work of late has been for the Intercept. You know, I'm mainly focused on the FBI's counterterrorism practices and programs, and looking at some of the abuses that have occurred in that neighborhood. A few years ago, I wrote a book, as you mentioned. It was the purpose of my last visit on your show, called The Terror Factory, and what that was about was the FBI's transformation post 9/11 from an organization that investigates crimes after the fact to the organization is today, which is very much an intelligence and counterterrorism agency. And the book took a specific focus at the FBI's use of informants. The fact that after 9/11, the FBI amassed, more than 15,000 informants in its ranks, and that it's used many of those informants in sting operations where they'll, troll Muslim communities looking for, in the FBI's view, people who could be terrorists, but in reality, they often find people who are, easily manipulated or, kind of more, more words than action. But for an FBI agent or an informant are really incapable of any significant violence. But the FBI, through these sting operations, provides these people with everything that they need and moves them forward in plots and then prosecutes them to the fullest extent of the law. And, if you look closely at the record of terrorism prosecutions, post 9/11, there are a few cases that involve really dangerous guys and, real terrorists in the United States. But, the vast majority tend to be these kind of mentally ill or easily vulnerable or manipulated guys that get lured into sting operations. And so that's been the focus of my work the last few years. But, as this story about the Bundy investigation shows, I'm really kind of more interested in the FBI's work broadly and, questions about, the ethics and morality and the way it investigates, some of its cases.
Yeah, which is a great topic. There's something very important that we need to keep our eyes. We need to be vigilant on this kind of thing because, just like you said, they get these incompetents who can't put together a plot themselves, or even probably wouldn't even want to. And you insert this one guy who's working for the FBI. He's getting funded by the FBI, and he got the savvy and the wherewithal to hook up a connection like that. And he gets them all rounded up together, and then they're all in a jackpot, and he walks away and works in the next group. Fascinating stuff that we even allow this to go on in our country, but it's just, I guess that's the way things are in 2017.
Yeah, no, there are some very, very egregious examples. The one that comes to my mind as far as sting operations involving terrorism of recent cases was this guy in upstate New York named Emmanuel Lutchman, who was known around town as the crazy guy who would scream on the street corner. He was homeless. He had no money. He told an FBI informant that he was in contact with someone from ISIS. Who knows if that's true? It seems hard to believe given that he was a homeless man. But he said that they set up this sting operation on him where he claimed that he wanted to attack a New Year's Eve, festival. And problem was, of course, they didn't have any weapons. He didn't have any money. And so to move the plot forward, the FBI informant gave him $40 so he could go to the local Walmart and purchase a machete and knives that he ultimately was, charged with trying to use for the attack, right? Like, he never got to the attack. He never attacked anyone. But, buying those weapons with the FBI's money was enough to prove the conspiracy that he wanted to commit this act of terrorism. And ultimately, he was charged and convicted. And that's an example of the type of case that they pursue, where kind of any reasonable person looking at the evidence would say, yeah, there's no way that this guy is in the same league as the real terrorists that we think of.
Yeah, but they got the headline. They got the headline. We caught one.
Yeah.
Oh man. Well,
there's a certain like wag the dog aspect to this, of course, right? That the FBI gets $3 billion every year for its counterterrorism and counterintelligence budget, and it can't just say like, hey, we looked around and we found one guy, or we didn't find anybody. The sting operations provide them with a very convenient and in good way to go to the public and go to Congress and say, hey, look at us, we're keeping America safe.
Yeah. So check out The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. The book will be, it's probably already in the Opera Report bookstore, but I'll put it back up on the blog with a link to this show here. So now, how'd you get, what happened with the Bundy thing? You stumbled first on the undercover FBI agent who got arrested in Colorado?
That actually came after we realized we had when we had the material. So the story of the quick kind of story, and I know I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with the Bundy family and the standoff, but basically the BLM and the federal government came down on Cliven Bundy for unpaid grazing fees that amounted to more than $1 million by 2014, and BLM using a trespassing warrant that was issued by a federal judge started rounding up the cattle. And this story kind of really blew up on social media, and a lot of people from right-wing militias to just everyday citizens really saw this as a government overreach and abuse of power, and came to Cliven's aid and protested against the government. Well, this resulted in basically an armed standoff between citizens supporting Cliven Bundy and Bureau of Land Management agents who were protecting the contract cowboys who were rounding up the cattle. And the federal government, fearing a kind of another Ruby Ridge, just decided to let the cattle go and retreat. And at that point, from what we know from court records and some testimony so far, the FBI then stepped in and said, okay, we're going to investigate how Cliven Bundy organized these armed men, and in doing so, what crimes were committed. And so what the FBI decided to do in order to basically investigate something that had long already occurred, they decided to create a fake documentary company called Longbow Productions, based in Nashville, Tennessee, and they really spared no expense. They bought expensive camera equipment, lighting, everything that a professional documentary crew would have. They had an office set up in Nashville, and they had a crew at various times of as many as 6 people, and filmed for nearly a year. And so what they ultimately produced was the raw material that really any documentary crew would produce. It was interviews with the primary suspects. It was, B-roll. It was also undercover audio. And this was turned over to the U.S. District Court in Las Vegas as evidence under seal in the trial against Cliven and his sons, and about a dozen supporters who were also indicted. And so we were able to obtain this footage, which is still under seal, and kind of tell the story of this undercover documentary crew, and how they went about investigating the Bundys.
Let me ask you this now, because the whole Bundy thing just kind of blew up out of nowhere, because this thing, his story up there with not wanting to pay his grazing and battling with BLM, that was going on for a long, long time. But it was the Pete Santilli video. And Pete Santilli, if you look into this guy, a lot of people think he's FBI. There was a whole big scandal where supposedly Anonymous hacked into his fax machine account, and they had some faxes going back and forth between him and the FBI, asking for he was complaining to the FBI that he wasn't being treated well. Did you come up with anything on that angle?
So I obviously know about Pete Santilli. I never was able to substantiate any of the rumors that he was working with the FBI. But, I mean, there is a direct connection between Pete Santilli and the publicity and ultimately the number of protesters that came to support Cliven Bundy. I mean, Santilli's internet radio show was kind of among the first to publicize Cliven's efforts. And then he also had a video that ended up going viral where at one point there were rumors going around that the BLM was mistreating Bundy's cattle, even killing the cattle. And the Bundy supporters set up a roadblock basically to stop the contract cowboys because they wanted to inspect the cattle to make sure that they were being treated well. And at one point, Cliven Bundy's sister, who had survived cancer and was not exactly the most threatening person, was thrown to the ground by BLM agents. And I believe it was Ammon. Ammon was attacked by one of the dogs, and then he kicked the dog, and then BLM agents tased him. And Santilli got all of this on video and put it on social media, and it was widely shared, and it became kind of a, for lack of a better description, kind of a rallying cry on social media for the abuses of power, or the perceived abuses of power, that the federal government was involved in. And then Santilli continued all the way through kind of the ultimate Malheur occupation as kind of an orbiting figure in the Bundy world. But whether he was an informant, I mean, I don't know about that. But I mean, he definitely was a provocateur of some sort. At the very least, kind of a media provocateur by following them and publicizing their kind of stand against the government.
And ultimately, he was arrested too.
He was arrested too. I believe, I'd have to double check this. I believe the charges against him in Oregon in the Malheur case were dropped, and but I think he still has a pending case in Nevada, if I remember correctly. There are so many defendants, it's hard to keep track of who's got an active case and who doesn't at this point.
Yeah. And in Nevada, I think the next hearing or something like that, or the trial starts like in July or June, something 26, something like that.
Yeah. So originally, so there were 6 defendants who recently were tried, and that trial did not involve Cliven and his sons. It involved involved a guy named Greg Burleson, who actually also, or we can confirm, was a former FBI informant, and several other people who had supported the Bundys. And in that trial, 2 people were convicted, including Burleson, and 4 ended in a hung jury. And so originally, Cliven and his sons and a few others were scheduled for trial starting June 26, but it was just announced late last week that the judge decided to retry the 4 who were hung on June 26th. So they're pushing Cliven and his sons back even further. And their lawyers have argued that this is a violation of speedy trial, and that Cliven and his sons have been waiting far too long to face trial. But the judge has so far been unconvinced by that argument. So
Greg Burleson was also an FBI informant. And how then when you look at this case, because especially with your perspective and your knowledge of this kind of area, does this fit into that? You know what I mean? Does this fit into the stereotype of what you find with these FBI operations?
So the one thing that's worth noting, and we note this in our story about Greg Burleson, is that when the ultimate documentary or fake documentary starts, Burleson is by then not on the FBI books. He's no longer an informant. But of the people that they interviewed, including Burleson, Burleson was the one who was the most kind of aggressive in his language about wanting to do harm to federal agents. I mean, he basically says, or he doesn't basically says, he says verbatim that, the reason that he went to Cliven Bundy's ranch was that, he wanted to put BLM agents 6 feet under, that he wanted to, go up against federal agents and attack them. And, the other people that they interviewed, were not saying things like that. Eric Parker, for example, who is the man in the famous or like iconic video of the Bundy standoff where he's at the overpass with a rifle in hand looking down on federal agents. He says in his interview, like, look, we didn't want violence. Nobody wanted to die that day. But in Burleson's case, what we know is that he lived in Arizona, and prior to coming up to support the Bundys, he had been involved with some right-wing groups that did border patrol officials. There was also a neo-Nazi guy named J.T. Reddy who had been involved in some crimes, and Burleson was providing information to the FBI during that period of time. At some point, Burleson was transferred. His handler in Arizona transferred him to an agent in Las Vegas as an informant prior to his coming up to support the Bundys. And that agent had closed him down. And it's not clear why. The FBI has not been upfront about why it closed down Burleson. And it's also unclear whether the undercover FBI agents who were acting as documentarians even knew that Burleson was a former FBI informant. But I mean, what is interesting about his story is that it's indicative often of the story of FBI informants, which is that they tend to be among the criminals, right? Like, you know, in this case, they're investigating all these guys for possibilities that they wanted to commit violence against federal agents. And it turns out, you know, lo and behold, the guy who seems most willing to want to do something like that is the former FBI informant. And so that's kind of indicative of the FBI in that sense, where, you know, they're often employing some pretty terrible people. To the FBI's credit, what they'll say is, well, look, choir boys can't catch the devil. It takes a devil to catch a devil, and that they often have to employ people of pretty odious character to find the others who are of odious character as well.
Well, they did a good job then with Burleson, because he came out of that J.T. Reddy group, and Reddy killed his girlfriend and her kids in a suicide household domestic thing where he killed his whole family that he was living with. You can't get much worse than that, in my opinion. So, and Burleson was the guy too. Now, is he the one? Am I correct that he inserted himself into the Bundy family and he was their gatekeeper? He called himself.
No, that was a guy who went by the name Buddha, or Brian Cavalier, and Brian Cavalier was also from Arizona, if my memory serves. Was a rather unusual guy, where he would describe having been a U.S. Special Forces Marine and having worked for Blackwater. It looks like it's actually kind of a case of stolen valor. Like, we could not find any example of Brian Cavalier having served in the U.S. Marine Corps. We tried to verify that from the U.S. Marine Corps. They have no record of him and his date of birth. But this was a guy who basically claimed that he was this badass Marine and had killed people in the sandbox, and then basically is coming there to protect the Bundys, and he basically inserts himself as something of the bodyguard for the Bundy family and the gatekeeper. And so what we see in the evidence that the fake documentary crew produced is that Buddha, or Brian Cavalier, is the guy that they're constantly going through and calling to set up interviews with Cliven Bundy and Ammon Bundy and Ryan Bundy. And there is this interesting story about kind of the culture that was created around the Bundys, right? Like, there was this kind of group that was created who followed Cliven, and in Buddha's case very specifically, were trying to protect Cliven. And I think the government from the outside looking in and seeing that had assumed that Cliven Bundy was this guy who was the mastermind, was organizing all of these right-wing elements and these militiamen and these armed, people who were taking a stand against the U.S. government. When in fact, I think the evidence really suggests that it was far more organic. I mean, I think even Cliven Bundy and the government really underestimated the power that social media had in distributing information about what was happening on the Nevada ranch and inspiring people to come out and support him in that way. Cliven, in his interview with the fake documentary crew, basically says, like, look, I did not ask these people to come here, but if you're asking me if these guys did me a solid, if they did me a favor, yeah, I'm really grateful for what they did. And I think one of the in the government's investigation of the case, I think one of their early mistakes of thinking was that, Cliven Bundy was this master organizer, when in fact, I think this was very much kind of an organic thing that also was, propelled a little bit by an early example of, like, fake news, right? Like, when we talk about fake news and now it's in the context of, claims that Russia meddled in the election and, distributed anti-Hillary messages. But, there was a certain amount of that existed with Cliven's case, right? Like, there was a lot of fake news about, like, how the BLM was mistreating the cattle and even killing the cattle. And these types of stories were circulating in social media, kind of further inspiring people to, to go and support Cliven. And so, the way the protests were organized and the way that so many people came with arms, with guns to support him, that was all very organic. And I think the government really underestimated that when it went to investigate Bundy as the mastermind of this kind of larger conspiracy in the government's view.
I had forgotten. You're so right about that, about the fake news that was going on. Because I live here, and I know that. In fact, the week before that the raid, I guess you'd call it, or the occupation by the BLM, my daughter was up there in Mesquite, which is right by Bundy Ranch, playing basketball. And as we were driving up there was a bunch of BLM cars, like, driver to driver, parked side by side, talking to each other. There's about 6 of those cars up there. And I says, well, why would they be up here? This is so weird. But there was so much weird news stories, like this stuff about China. They sold mineral rights to China, and Harry Reid was doing land deals. And even Pete Santilli, I remember listening to some of his broadcasts where he's talking about he's thinking that he's near Lake Mead. He's up there in Mesquite. He doesn't even know where he is, and because there had been a bicyclist that was shot by the BLM on Lake at Red Rock, and he thought he was near Red Rock. It was just so bizarre coming from a local. Like everyone thought it was like everything was like right next door to each other. It was like hours away from each other. And you can't do this story, too. I read your article. You can't write this article without the word bizarre in the title. You know what I mean? It's just...
Absolutely. Yeah. I remember, one of the comments to our story actually mentioned, criticized us and said, like, hey, you didn't talk about how Harry Reid was going to, benefit financially by, confiscating the Bundy land. And, there was this element of fake news that just circulated very broadly. And it definitely had its effect here. I think this is kind of the new media ecosystem that we're now living in, where we're always going to face things like this. But in some ways, the what we're seeing on the presidential campaign, the questions there, those existed within the Bundy claims or the Bundy story. And also, this was a cause that was taken up by, the InfoWars of the right-wing media. And so, the organizations that were championing this issue are also the same ones that would peddle in conspiracy theories. And so, it just created an environment where, a lot of fake news was distributed, and it made it seem like the government was overstepping its power perhaps a lot more than it really was. That said, the government did some really stupid things, right? Like, in trying to corral the protesters, it was a really dumb idea to create First Amendment areas, right? I don't think the government intended to, silence people. They were looking at public safety, but like things like that then I think further inflamed a lot of the conspiracy theories that were at play already.
Yeah, the free speech zones, that's just what you need to mention to a bunch of constitutionalists, who are armchair constitutional lawyers. But, you mentioned, too, about the fake news. Another thing that just jumped out at me was, especially toward the end, when they were having that standoff, that final standoff up there in Oregon, when there was only 3 or 4 guys left up there. One of the guys who was the most extreme said that the reason why he was holding out is because he was listening on internet radio and hearing that reinforcements were coming, that there were brigades of people coming over. Crazy stories. They were coming by foot over the desert to join him. And that's why they held out so long, because they were listening to internet radio shows of people talk. And also, too, that they thought that ATF and the FBI were going door to door up there in Oregon for arresting supporters in their home. So much of this, you're right, is just driven by propaganda and disinformation.
Right, and it's a scary thing to think, right? I mean, fortunately, there wasn't any shooting at the Bundy standoff, and fortunately, the Malheur standoff was not as awful and deadly as it perhaps could have been. But in both of these cases, I mean, these were things that people were encouraged to get involved in because they were reading misinformation and bad information. Speaking of Santilli and Pete Pete Santilli, I mean, he played a part of that, right? I mean, basically, the Bundys had their own like media operation, and Pete Santilli, who is reporting from the scene, both in Nevada and at Malheur in Oregon, and a lot of like misinformation resulted in part from that, and then in part from kind of the amplifying effect that happens on social media, with stories like this. And the truth is, like, the reason I think fake news circulates so quickly and so widely is that, hey, a guy in dispute with the federal government over unpaid grazing fees, that sounds kind of outrageous, but you're not going to travel across the country with your gun to defend him. But someone who's like, having his land confiscated because Harry Reid, wants it for his own personal profit, and the protesters have been put in First Amendment zones because they're chilling free speech and they're killing the cattle, and all these things that were untrue. That's the type of stuff that gets people like really riled up, and I think there was a fair amount of misinformation that was fueling the Bundy supporters.
It's so true, and China's involved. Somehow China's getting this land. It's just insane. Now, one of the things I think it was this Brian Cavalier was saying. He was saying that the Bundys and their militia that they had going on were doing their own FBI background checks. He even said, "We checked you guys out with the FBI when they're talking about the film crew." Now, did you find any reality to that, or was this just fantasy going on in their heads?
Yeah, I mean, we liked it because it was a funny line, right? Like, yeah. Brian Cavalier doesn't realize that these people are actually undercover FBI, and he's telling them, hey, we checked you out and we found out you're not ATF or FBI. So it's hard to know. I mean, it was clear that the FBI was concerned about law enforcement agents and possibly even federal agents in the FBI and elsewhere being in league with the Bundys in some way. And so when Brian Cavalier tells the undercover agents that, yeah, we have sources who are checking Bundy's name in the warrant database every morning and telling us what's going on, I think the FBI took that seriously. My sense, is that it's possible that Brian Cavalier had some law enforcement sources. But I also think it's just as possible that, here's a guy who seems to be a case of stolen valor, tends to make up stories. That might have been one that he made up just for his, because of his own, illusions of grandeur about who he was and the importance that he had in the Bundy standoff.
Well, they did have some sheriffs up there, some former sheriffs and some active sheriffs who would definitely have access to that kind of warrant information, stuff like that, NCIC. So, but who knows? Because obviously, whatever they were doing didn't work. Cause they were all
exactly. And I think that's why. I think that's why the FBI took that claim seriously. Yeah. And when Brian Cavalier tells them that they have these sources, one of the things that you hear the FBI agents ask almost everyone in the interviews is, about possible law enforcement sources that are helping them in the background, and that definitely was a concern for the FBI and figuring out whether there were, kind of any leaks of information or any kind of law enforcement connections that were helping the Bundys.
And you were able to watch all these interviews cover to cover. How many hours?
Yeah, it's a lot. It was 100 hours, or about 110 hours of material between audio and video, and my colleague Ryan Devereaux and I, split it up and just to keep ourselves sane, and then transcribed and made notes, where appropriate. There was some duplication. It's worth noting. I mean, the entire ball of wax in audio and video that we had was about 110 hours. But, one of the things that the FBI would do, for example, is when they would have an interview with someone in a hotel room, they would have the main camera set up for the interview, but then they would have a constellation of hidden cameras throughout the room. And so some of the action that occurs in the 110 hours is duplicative of other hours, because basically, an hour of an interview would be recorded 4 times because there's the main camera and there's 3 hidden cameras. But at the same time, the reason they had those hidden cameras was, the FBI was recording things that were being said, off the record, so to speak. Before the actual official camera started rolling, they were, getting to know each other in the hotel room before the subject of the interview sat down for the formal interview, and those conversations were captured. And then it's also worth noting that, and I think this was the most interesting part, in addition to kind of the formal interviews that they would do, there were also recordings of the undercover FBI agents calling the Bundys and the various supporters to set up interviews, and so what happens when a standard documentary filmmaker calls somebody and says, hey, would you like to do an interview with us? There's the questions of, well, who are you and what's your project about and when will it be released and where will it be released? And those conversations, of course, occurred with the undercover FBI agents. So it was really kind of interesting to hear what they would say in describing what their project was and where it would be released. But also what was interesting, too, is that the Bundys were clearly suspicious of this group of documentary filmmakers. I mean, they couldn't find examples of their previous work because obviously there wasn't any. There was an impression that these guys were possibly moles for the FBI. And these are questions that are asked both on telephone calls as well as in the actual interviews, and the FBI agents are constantly having to fight back on these perceptions and push back and say, like, basically no, we're making a legitimate documentary. And I think what the FBI did raises a couple of really concerning questions, I think, right? Like, one is it appropriate for the FBI to pose as journalists in order to get close to criminal suspects, right? Like, is that an appropriate cover? The context of this is that we know very little about how often the FBI does stuff like this. But what we do know is that there was a case in 2007 or 2006, I believe, where a teenager in Seattle was sending bomb threats to his high school. And because he was using proxy servers, the FBI was unable to figure out where these threats were coming from. And so they had an email address for the person, and they posed as Associated Press journalists and sent the person a link to an article that, when clicked, surreptitiously installed tracking software, and then they were able to find this teenager. And when this occurred, and after this became public, there was an outcry from the Associated Press and from the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, saying, look, this is totally inappropriate. And James Comey, the now former FBI director, had written a letter to the New York Times saying, like, well, look, there are times when this is appropriate, but we do it in very rare occasions. And the overall message was that they do it for occasions when there is no better cover for cases that involve immediate public safety concerns. And I think in this case, the Bundy investigation, I mean, any crimes that had occurred had already happened, right? So there was no argument that this was a pressing public safety concern, and yet they used the undercover they used pretending to be journalists as their cover. And then the second question this raises is, like, what ultimate effect this has on journalists, right? I mean, documentary filmmakers and journalists all the time are facing questions of, like, hey, are you guys maybe working for the government? Are you guys moles? And, like, now there's actually a case you can point to say, like, yeah, the government does this. And I think, at a time of unprecedented attacks by the government on the press and, unprecedented language to try to delegitimize the press, it's really concerning that the FBI is posing as journalists in a way that I think will, cause a chilling effect and make people who, might be concerned about whether a journalist or a documentarian is part of the government, they may shy away from working with that journalist for that reason.
Fascinating. And also, again, along the same lines as your book, The Terror Factory, even though they had this undercover documentary film crew, much of the information, it says in the article, much of the information that they found out, they could have found out just by going on these guys' Facebook pages, because the stuff they were saying they had already said in other interviews and on Facebook and social media and in public. Did they come up with anything new?
No, and so that's what's most fascinating, right? So you have 5 or 6 FBI agents who work on this for nearly a year, traveling to 5 different states, producing more than 100 hours of audio and video, and we can conclusively say that there was nothing in these audio and video recordings that they couldn't have found in other ways. I mean, Cliven Bundy and Ryan Bundy and Ammon Bundy and a lot of these supporters, they gave interviews to, mainstream press like local Las Vegas television stations and the Associated Press and others, as well as kind of more marginal press like, Pete Santilli's radio show. And, all of the information that the FBI was able to acquire through this fake documentary project, they basically could have acquired just by like Googling Cliven Bundy in Google videos and, watching what he said. Because the truth is that Cliven Bundy and the others did not say anything to the fake documentary crew that they had not said to dozens of journalists before. And the funny thing was, like, we mentioned this in the article, is that in Cliven Bundy's interview, when he's finally when he's finally persuaded to sit down for the interview with the fake documentary crew, he basically says that. He says something to the effect of, this morning I've already talked to 2 radio stations, and I've got a whiteboard where there's notes to talk to other journalists, and what I really like is my ability to talk to journalists like you and tell the story. And to him, to Cliven, I don't think. I mean, I know he didn't think of these people as any different from any other journalist. And what's interesting is, like, he didn't tell them anything that was noteworthy or newsworthy, or, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think anything incriminating, to be honest. And so they spent all this time, all this money, and, they really could have, built as much a case or acquired as much intelligence just by, looking at the video and radio interviews that Cliven and his supporters had already given.
Fascinating. This whole thing is just so fascinating. Now, has there been a hearing whether or not that all this footage would be admissible in court?
Yeah, so the case that ended with Greg Burleson and another man being convicted and 4 other defendants being acquitted, the judge did allow clips from the videos to be used. And in fact, the lead undercover agent, a guy who goes by the name Charles Johnson, testified for a day and a half about his activities there. And so they did allow those in. And now the 4 whose verdict ended in a hung jury are being retried starting June 26th. And my expectation would be that the government would use the video. I mean, they certainly are allowed to. There were several jurors after the last trial who were actually quoted in the Las Vegas papers, just saying that basically that they felt that the undercover video actually had the opposite effect. They felt it was intrusive and, did not prove anything criminal, and kind of proved the government's pressure or kind of desire to find ways to convict these people. And so it's possible that the government would choose not to use it for that reason, but I suspect that, given as much effort as they put into these audio and video recordings and the lack of other evidence otherwise, that they're likely to use it. And I would suspect that they would definitely use it for the trials of Cliven, Ryan, and Ammon Bundy, which will come later this year. In large part because, those are the main focuses of the documentary investigation or the fake documentary investigation. And so, they have lots of, video to work with on that. Cliven's lawyers and the lawyers for Cliven's son have argued that, this evidence should not be allowed because it was specifically established or created as a way of trying to find ways that they would say things that would incriminate themselves. And, each of their interviews is hours long. And, ultimately what the government will show the jury will be, clips of a few minutes here and a few minutes there. And their lawyers have argued that that's unfair. It should not be allowed into evidence. But, the judge so far has disagreed and has given them a pretty wide berth in using that evidence.
Fascinating. You would think they're such constitutionalists, that they would take this over to the Supreme Court, but I guess they will, depending on the outcome of the trial. Now, I cut you off. I was talking about how did you think they would take this to the Supreme Court? Oh yeah,
they could challenge this type of evidence, through the appellate system. But yeah. I believe the route for that would be that they ultimately would have to go through with the trial and have a disposition before they could challenge and ask for a retrial based on, this type of evidence. So, certainly that's something that the appellate courts and perhaps even the Supreme Court could weigh in on. But, that's going to be years down the road, assuming that there's a conviction for the Bundys in this case.
Now, it's interesting because in this other article, this Longbow Productions pops up again with this guy who was something about a strip club and a condo project in Colorado. And what's going on with that?
Yeah, so, using my, masterful investigative skills, when we got this cache of like investigative or video and audio from the fake documentary, we found out that this guy's name was Charles Johnson, right? So I just Googled Charles Johnson FBI and thought like, well, what the hell's going to come up? Probably nothing. And it turned out there was this bizarre story from a local television station in Denver about this guy named Charles Johnson who had been knocking on doors and harassing people, and when he was charged with working as a private investigator without a license, the FBI had sent a letter to the local prosecutors asking them to drop the charges. And the Denver TV station didn't know that Charles Johnson was an FBI agent, didn't know what any of this was about, other than that it was strange that this guy would knock on doors and get arrested, and then have the FBI say, hey guys, can you please drop these charges? And so I, following up on that, thinking maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not, asked the Glendale police. And Glendale, it's worth noting, is this really tiny town that's it's totally surrounded by the city of Denver, and historically it was known as kind of a nightlife district. And so I contacted the Glendale police and asked them for the police report related to the arrest, and so they send me this 20 or 30 page report that documented their investigation. And then they also noted in their report that there was video from when he was arrested, and that there was this interrogation video, and so I requested that as well. And what was interesting was that in the police report, he had used a business card that identified himself as Charles Johnson, investigative consultant, but it used the same phone number and address as the Longbow Productions office in Nashville, Tennessee. And then in addition, there was this video of his interrogation, and during the documentary filming for the Bundy investigation, Johnson had at various times got himself in front of the camera. So we had images of him as well, and it was clear that it was this same guy. And so what ultimately the FBI was investigating in Colorado is a little unclear. I mean, given the circumstances, it seems that they were investigating some sort of public corruption related to a land deal. And the deal was that there was this rug store on this very premium spot of land that was right near this large-scale development that the city was trying to do to create this project called Glendale 180. It would be like a nightlife district near Glendale, or Cherry Creek is the little waterway that runs through the city. And the city wanted to purchase this land because it was central to their redevelopment project. But the owner wanted to instead build this condo development because he wanted to maximize the value of the land. And there was this little newspaper called the Cherry Creek Chronicle that was running these stories that were vehemently opposed to the development, going as far as referring to it as the Tehranian Death Star, because the guy who owned the land was Iranian. And so then ultimately what Charles Johnson does is he goes into town and he starts knocking on the doors of people who were quoted in the newspaper as opposed to the project, many of whom were actually employees of the local strip club called Shotgun Willie's, which, as it happens, was owned by the mayor's wife. And so this very seemingly incestuous thing was going on. But as Charles Johnson was investigating, he was kind of freaking people out, so they were calling the police. And the local Glendale police end up deciding to run a sting on Charles Johnson. So one of the people that he had contacted was this guy named Doug Stiff, who was a strip club DJ at Shotgun Willie's. And Sean Farley, a detective for the Glendale police, decides that he's going to go undercover and pretend to be Doug's friend. They're going to meet Charles Johnson at a restaurant and talk about what he's trying to do. And that's at that point Charles Johnson said that he was an investigator who'd been hired by a journalist who he wouldn't name, and was there to investigate this apparent condo project. And so they talked to him for an hour, and the Glendale police do their research, and they realize that, basically what he's doing is acting as a private investigator in a state where you need a license to do that. And so he was basically in violation of state law. And they end up arresting him and charging him with that, haul him into haul him into an interrogation room, and he's got this really convoluted story about who he is and what he's doing. At the time, he was carrying 3 IDs, one from Hawaii, another from Tennessee, and a third from Florida. And, so was doing like things that were highly suspicious to the local police. And so they charge him. And then, of course, he gets released. He was given a notice to appear in court. And that's when the FBI sent a letter to local prosecutors and said, hey, we can't tell you why, but we need you to drop these charges. And the local prosecutors agreed, even though, they certainly weren't compelled to do that. And what was interesting for us was that this all happened, a few months after the fake documentary project had closed. And so it's clear that for whatever reason, Charles Johnston is this undercover agent who is moving from city to city, but that he also continues to use this journalistic cover for his assignments. And, again, another example where this was not a case that involved immediate public safety concerns for which you might say, okay, well, it's okay that they're posing as journalists. This was just seemingly a standard investigation, and they chose to use a journalistic cover. And so it does suggest that the FBI is using journalistic covers far more often than they've admitted publicly, because these are the cases we know about, but certainly it's reasonable to assume that there are cases that have not been made public where the FBI was using journalistic covers.
Did you ever determine why the FBI was interested in this little condo project in this?
Yeah, so the local newspaper publisher, says that the man who owns the land has connection to the FBI. That's not something that can be proven, and it isn't certainly something I'd endorse. I suspect that the FBI was investigating possible collusion related to the land deal in some way between the newspaper and the and City Hall. That would be my guess, just based on the people that he contacted. But no charges have been filed. I think it's important to be upfront and say that there's no evidence to suggest that any crime had been committed. It's just that for whatever reason the FBI was investigating this. And then the weird thing too is in my work I talk to a lot of former and current FBI agents, and sometimes on background, and they help me just understand the process or the policies or what an agent might do. And everyone I talked to about what happened in Colorado, they all thought that Charles Johnson must have been acting alone. He must have gone off the reservation, right? Because it was totally against protocol for you to have 3 different IDs on you, right? It's not unusual for an undercover agent to have more than one ID from various states, but you would never carry them all at the same time. They're in your desk at the FBI office, and you pull out the one as necessary. And then the other thing is that it's highly unusual to allow a FBI agent to get arrested. I mean, normally if an FBI agent was arrested and he was undercover, there would have been another agent who was watching what was going on, and he would have stepped up and said, hey, look, you got to stop this. He's an FBI agent. Let me explain. And none of that happened in this case. And so the FBI agents I talked to all speculated that, he must have been off the reservation doing his own thing. But then, as the letter from the FBI suggests, either he was on his own doing his own thing and they decided to cover for him, or he was involved in some sort of investigation, and after he was arrested, the FBI stepped in and asked the prosecutors not to press charges.
Yeah, that sounds plausible. Also, too, on the other hand, too, it's also very unusual because they just passed that law in Colorado where licensing was required, and there was a grace period that went on for a very long time. He was probably the only person in that little town. I'm sure he was the only person ever investigated or arrested for unlicensed PI work in Colorado, which is like jaywalking in Manhattan, okay? So it had to be politically motivated that they got their cop friend that probably let the topless bar's wife guy, went down there and got her, because the mayor's wife was involved in all this. I'm sure they had some kind of political motivation. Fascinating. That's a fascinating story all by itself.
Yeah, and then I'm sure there's a lot more to it than what we were able to report. But it was definitely kind of funny footnote to the larger Bundy story.
Yeah, and this guy's jeopardizing his big giant Bundy case by walking around with the business card with the address on it.
Right. The other thing that's worth mentioning too is I talked to the lawyers who are representing Bundy and the other defendants, and normally when an FBI agent is involved in any sort of crime, whether it's something that's off duty, like a DUI or, something on duty, like with Johnson, where he was arrested while on official business, that's considered giglio material, which is meant like whenever there's a witness who's provided in a criminal defense, the government is obligated to provide any information that would potentially impeach the witness. So if you're busted for a DUI, that's something that you can bring up in testimony to impeach the witness's credibility. In Johnson's case, he was arrested for practicing as a PI without a license. Even though he wasn't convicted, his arrest is likely, giglio material. And apparently the FBI and the Department of Justice did not turn that over to the lawyers, prosecuting Bundy and the others.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, we talked to the lawyers who were representing Bundy and the others, and they all said that they were unaware of the arrest in Colorado. I mean, we wrote the story, so I mean, clearly they are now, but it is concerning and questionable of why the FBI would not turn that information over. I mean, that is giglio material and seems particularly relevant to the Bundy case in particular, because he was using a journalistic cover, trying to get out from being prosecuted for practicing as a PI without a license by claiming kind of the journalistic exemption, right? Because the PI license law in Colorado, for obvious or for First Amendment reasons, built a carve out for a journalist. So if I, Trevor Aaronson, the journalist, knock on doors in Glendale asking questions, I can't be charged with acting as a private investigator without a license because I'm First Amendment protected under the journalism carve out. And that's what he was trying to do to kind of wiggle out of being arrested by saying, look, I'm an investigator, but I was hired by a journalist. And that after Glendale reviewed the law, I mean, they realized that, that was just a way of him trying to wiggle out, and that, the law in their view covered journalists like me if I were to do it, but if I hired you to investigate as a private investigator or another private investigator, and they weren't licensed in Colorado, and I said, hey, I'll give you $200 if you go around asking these questions, essentially I'm employing you as a private investigator, and you would need to be licensed under Colorado law according to the guidelines that or the interpretation that the Glendale police had of the law.
Interesting too. He had to be acting pretty heavy-handed too for so many people to be contacting the police after he contacted them, unless they were all friends of whoever it was who sicked the cops on this guy to begin with. We're almost out of time, and real quick, we talked about the Millers off the air for a couple of minutes. The Millers were that couple. They came down and they were up at Bundy Ranch for a while. And then we uncovered that first they were at the Million Mask March and that they were at the Occupy Wall Street. Then they came here to Nevada, supposedly to follow the career of David Laurie Vanderbeek, who was running for governor here on this party that's affiliated with Jesse Ventura. It's like this fringe party. And they were friends with David Laurie Vanderbeek, and they were friends with Gordon Martinez, who was running for sheriff, and he had a Gordon Martinez for sheriff T-shirt on their YouTube video, and they went up to Bundy Ranch, and then they wound up shooting a couple of the Millers. Did I lose you? I might have lost them. I still see him here, but I think I got an internet glitch. That would suck. Can you hear me? Sometimes. That would suck. I lose him here. Speakers. Are you there now? I lost him. Okay, I'll make another call. Got disconnected by Skype. Sorry about that. But we're talking to Trevor Aaronson, TrevorAaronson.com. Hey, got your back, Trevor?
Yeah, hey, sorry about that. The audio just dropped off, so sorry about that.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out what it was, but it was Skype. So anyway, I was asking you about the Millers. What did you come up with when you were in watching these videos and stuff like that? Did the name of the Millers come up?
Yeah, so I mean, it came up in conversations with the subjects of the interviews and the FBI agents. I mean, I don't think the FBI agents were overly concerned with the Millers, but there was definitely questions that were raised about like who they were and who they were connected to. Burleson, the former FBI informant, mentions them a few times, and so I also think that there was a perception among the FBI that the threat of violence among the supporters for Cliven Bundy was high because of people like the Millers. They thought maybe there were more like them there. It certainly wasn't kind of a large part of their investigation, but from the questions that they answered, it was definitely something that was on their mind.
Fascinating. The whole Miller case is just so bizarre because usually when police are shot here in Vegas, days and days of funerals and memorials and all kind of stuff like that. Nothing like that with this case. And even people who knew the Millers, like I said, David Laurie Vanderbeek that was running for governor and Gordon Martinez that was running for sheriff, were never questioned by the police or the FBI about their association with these two characters. Totally bizarre case. Trevor Aaronson, I can't thank you enough. Next time, anything you ever want to promote or you want to give us recipes, you want to get on the air, call me up, man. I'll put you right on the air. I really, really enjoyed this. The articles here, bizarre story behind the FBI's fake documentary about Bundy family, excellent. And it's how an undercover FBI agent pretending to be a journalist winds up in jail. TrevorAaronson.com and also The Terror Factory, inside the FBI's manufactured war on terror. Do you want to leave us with anything before you go?
No. I mean, I just really enjoyed the talk, and I appreciate that there's an audience out there for these types of stories.
Oh yeah, and especially the first show too. The audience loved it, so I'm sure they're going to love this too as well. Thank you, Trevor. Keep in touch, okay?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ed.
Good night.